Okay, so good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's Lunch and Learn, a weekly event of the S&P Sephardi Community here in London, where each week a different one of the rabbis from across our community are spending some time with those who like to take a little break in the middle of their day for a chance to say hi to each other and also to study. There's no set topic for these for these lunch and learns, at least not for the time being. We've kind of left it open for each rabbi to kind of share something that they think is relevant or interesting to the rest of the group. I'm going to be speaking about today a topic which I thought would be of interest or appropriate to today. Today is International Women's Day. And so I decided that I would speak about a topic that I'm personally quite interested in for those that have attended some of my other lectures, which is about a particular group of women within our community. And these women were really trailblazing, if I could call that, though maybe we'll kind of reflect on how trailblazing they were. But we're trailblazing as a group of women in the middle of the 19th century who took it upon themselves individually, though I think collectively they kind of represent a trend, to produce Judaic publications within London's Sephardic community. And there were all those beyond our Sephardic community to the Sephardic community in America as well. The reason that I say, I'm not sure whether to call it trailblazing or not, isn't that they weren't trailblazing in their own time, but more because their, this kind of activity, I would say, was ultimately short-lived. It's almost a blip on the screen that lasts for about 2 decades of women kind of publishing and writing works of Jewish interest, but then you don't really find it again, unfortunately. And part of my interest in it is that it's historically interesting, but I think it's actually really important, and almost I hope that by highlighting their achievements and their commitment, that this would hopefully act as a important example, for others within our community, women and men, to also engage in the study of Judaism and to feel empowered to not just be recipients of such knowledge, but also to contribute to its development as well. And certainly these women did just that. And therefore, I think kind of thinking about them and studying about them and seeing what they accomplished is hopefully meaningful for us as well in our own lives, in addition to kind of just interesting historically as well. And so in a little bit, I'll share my screen where we can take a look at some images of some of these women, as well as some images of the works that they produced. But they range from kind of the late 1830s till the late 1850s. So about 20 years that we're talking about. And it was during a time of great, shall we say, upheaval in society in general, and within the community more specifically. Certainly when we think of the society during the 1840s, there's quite a lot of change which is happening, right? It's a time of great urbanization in England. It's a time of shall we say, I don't know if professionalization is the correct word, but kind of organizational changes around England, right, with the institutions of all kinds of, moving into what might be known as the welfare state, right? This idea of, where things are not just kind of haphazard, where, things are just kind of happening on a completely local level, but there's more of kind of a sense of a national strategy towards towards welfare, towards education, towards documentation, record keeping, all of those types of things. So there's this kind of just general interest about, shall we say, modernizing the methods within society. And then, of course, we find that there is something similar happening within the Sephardic community as well, within many of the institutions. It's during this time that you have what was known as the Board of Guardians of the Spanish and Portuguese established, which was a kind of a more tightly organized charity within the community, where previously, the Parnasim just kind of doled out funds. Now it was kind of a separate body that would be doing that. That would eventually lead to what we have today of the Welfare Board. And so there's kind of this institutional changes. You think of, there were changes that happened within the Board of Shechita and within the educational institution. So there's lots of those kinds of things happening. And then there's this other change as well, which of course is the first breakaway synagogue, that of the establishment of the West London Synagogue of British Jews, which is a Reform congregation. And so that is also leading to changes as well. And so you kind of have from 1841, where that community is established, right, kind of now two communities at play, one more traditional, one more, shall we say, progressive or radical or liberal or reform, right? Depending on whatever kind of term you want to use. None of them quite really capture it. And there's also activities going on in society with increased vigor towards missionary activity as well, with kind of this increase in poverty in London. There's activity among Christian organizations that are trying to help people who are poor, but there's also an educational component as well. And so the Jewish community is kind of caught in that too, with how do they care for their poor, and are missionaries actually trying to convert Jews away. We know there had been conversions in the community. We think of probably the most famous of them is Benjamin Disraeli, but he wasn't alone. There were other families that had adopted Church of England too. So there's kind of a lot of, I don't know, a sense of lack of direction. And it's kind of in this moment in time that you all of a sudden have a group of women, again, not necessarily as a group, but individually, who kind of rise to the challenge of saying, the community needs more robust, I don't want to say just educational material, but literature, Jewish literature that will be act as a source of learning and inspiration and meaning for the community. And it ends up reflecting a range of literature. We're not talking about one specific genre, but we're dealing with things from novels of Jewish settings. So you think of kind of responding to kind of maybe some anti-Semitic caricatures of Jews in literature in England during this time. And so Jews are going to produce novels that present Jews in a different way. And from that, from kind of guides, how to learn to read Hebrew, to things that are more, shall we say, theological in nature as well. And so there's kind of a whole spectrum of the kinds of materials that these women will produce. And so it's something which is remarkable and incredibly important. And it seems, and this is what's interesting about it, that these women step forward not only in a situation where there is a need for, shall we say, a response to the challenges of the day, but they're also stepping into what is in some respects a vacuum of leadership as well. In fact, during these decades, there is no chacham of the community. The last chacham was Chacham Raphael Meldela, who was a great scholar who had come from Livorno. And he passes away, I believe it's in 1828. And essentially in his place, there is a there is nobody kind of who fully replaces him. His son, David Meldela, will assume the role of the Av Bet Din, the head of the community's rabbinic court, and his son-in-law, David Aaron de Sola, will be the chazan of the synagogue. And so you'll have two people that will play important roles within the community, but the community does not kind of appoint one of them as, the kind of overall head of the community. And why exactly that is, I'm not entirely sure right now. It could just be that they felt they had two capable people and essentially kind of empowered them to play their role. Now, they did contribute to these subjects, and we'll see that they mentored and also encouraged these women to produce their materials, though they themselves didn't produce things like this. And so that's something which is quite interesting. But it wasn't that they were kind of like not active in it, but it was through kind of a kind of almost an editorial type of role. Now they did produce some things, particularly Reverend De Sola produced quite a number of translations of works. He translated the prayer books into a kind of a new modern translation, which was important. He started translating the Bible. He did Genesis. He translated the Mishnah, a very important text of the oral law. He produced a book of brachot, of blessings and prayers, also with English translation. So he did produce quite a lot, but his was in kind of the role of like kind of the classical texts, making them more accessible to the public, but not necessarily producing kind of like original works from scratch, if that were. But it was these women who actually did that. And I think that they're a fascinating group. I'm working on a PhD now and about this whole kind of like moment in time. And I will have a chapter in that devoted to these women within the Sephardic community, because I think they are a very important part of that story, of the kind of the intellectual reactions and responses to the changes that are happening around them during the time, both from without the Jewish community and changes within the Jewish community as well. So we'll take a look at them. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to share my screen with you so that you can see some of them. And what I'd like to do is to really just kind of go through with you 5 of these women, okay? And some of them you may have heard of before, though I suspect some of them you won't be familiar with. So the one I'm going to start with is probably the most well-known out of all of them. And this is because she produced a huge body of literature during her life, and even posthumously. Her mother published some of her works. She didn't live to old age, unfortunately, but she produced a range of works from novels to a history to books on Judaism, and so really did a lot of different types of things. It seemed earlier in her career, the literature she produced was probably primarily for actually a non-Jewish audience, but it seems kind of as she gets a bit older, her focus seems to shift a bit towards producing materials that will serve more directly the Jewish community. And so this is Grace Aguilar. If you ever pick up something that kind of shows literature in 19th century England, they'll usually have an example from her. She was a literary figure because of some of the things that she produced. But within the Jewish community, she certainly was the most well-known of all of these individuals, and she published in England and in America. This work that I have here, The Spirit of Judaism, is essentially a commentary, as it were, on the Shemang. You can tell she's Spanish and Portuguese, not from this, but on the opposite cover page of this, she spells Shemang Yisrael in English, and she spells it Shemang. So she does the nga for the ayin, which is kind of the classic Spanish and Portuguese transliteration of the ngayin, kind of the N sound. So she was of the community, absolutely. And so this is obviously a work about Judaism. It's a bit of a theological work. This work was actually published by Isaac Leeser, who was the reverend in Philadelphia of their Spanish and Portuguese community, Mikveh Israel. And he produced it actually with a commentary running along it, pointing out all the areas where he disagreed with what she wrote. She wasn't very happy about that, but that's for another story. But that's just one example of one of the works that she produced. She produced a very important work called Women of Israel, which was, I think, ends up being a 3-volume work with a different chapter on basically all the women of the Bible and kind of into the Second Temple period. And that was probably her most kind of studied work ultimately within the Jewish community. It was produced for Hebrew schools for decades, both in America and in England, as a text which highlighted, the women in the community in Jewish history. So, again, for her, she clearly wanted to promote that idea of, look, women in leadership roles, women who are scholars, who are spiritual guides, is nothing, novel. That you find that throughout the Bible, and obviously that was her way of trying to probably advance, this cause, that it should go beyond just kind of her moment in time. I think in that respect, she ends up being a bit before her time, but so that's one probably important figure. The next I want to do is a different kind of text, and these are dictionaries and Hebrew vocabularies. The one on the left is produced, as you can see, in 1846, and this is by another member of the community, Abigail Lindo. The Lindo family, and she produces a dictionary, a Hebrew and English dictionary. You can see with roots and abbreviations. And to its right is another work which sometimes actually gets confused in library collections, because this is produced in 1848, and it's called a Hebrew and English vocabulary, and it just says by a lady. So as a result, some libraries have actually have kind of confused these two works, and sometimes we'll label them both the same way, but they're two different works that were produced. The second one, this in Hebrew, the Me'ir Ayin B'nei HaNeurim, enlightening the eyes, the seeing of the children, is really kind of like a word-for-word translation of prayers. And so it's a way to kind of learn the prayers through word-by-word translations of them. You find today there's a publisher called Mitsuda. So the Mitsuda prayer book is very much that style. And it's a way of, one, just understanding the prayers more specifically, but it actually helps to learn Hebrew as well, because you really see word by word what each of the words means in English. And so these were obviously meant for children as a way for them to learn Hebrew. So you think again about kind of the professionalization of education, that there should be texts that children use, and not kind of the way that maybe children learned more in the 18th century, which was just through study, that they kind of slowly learned the Hebrew. But this is kind of a bit more of like a formal, direct approach to educating children about Hebrew. It could be that there were changes in the kinds of education children were receiving that maybe meant the old style no longer was effective, and they actually needed these types of texts to kind of work in a new educational setting. Certainly the kinds of education children were receiving were starting to change from just kind of a religious school setting to one that was also teaching them, a range of subjects, more of like a broad liberal arts type of education. Okay, moving on. This is another well-known English lady, and this is Lady Judith Montefiore. This work is actually quite different from the other ones. Similar in that it just says edited by a lady. So again, you can find that some women in the community didn't produce under their name. They just would kind of say by someone, maybe as a type of modesty somehow, that was considered inappropriate. That's for a different discussion. But she produced what essentially is a cookbook. But it's a really interesting cookbook. It's the first English language kosher cookbook to ever be put together. And what it's essentially trying to do is to produce a cookbook for advancing middle-class Jews to be able to adapt English recipes to the kosher kitchen. And so it's, again, trying to enable Jewish people to kind of fit in more and to kind of enjoy kind of contemporary society, but in a way which is kosher, right? Literally and figuratively. And so it's a really interesting cookbook. But she also has a bit in the end of this cookbook where she talks about, she says, that ultimately she writes about food, and then she writes about things that women can do to enhance their beauty, cosmetics and hair products and things like that, things you can create at home. And then her last section is she says, the most beautiful thing about a woman, though, is her mind. And it's a really beautiful kind of way that she caps it, that despite kind of talking about the role in the kitchen or the role, just to look pretty, ultimately, real beauty comes from the intellect. And I think that's really, again, driving home this point that, that's the ultimate, place for women, just like it would be for a man, and perhaps kind of saying that there is a point beyond kind of these, this domestication, but that actually, at the end of the day, everybody can kind of contribute to intellectual development and to the production of literature. So that's an important one. She produces this in the 1850s, I believe. I believe that's the year, maybe in the 1840s. I think the 1850s. Moving on over here, this is a book, again, also not, doesn't say who wrote it. It just has a few words to the Jews by one of themselves. This is produced by someone by the name of Charlotte Montefiore. She's a niece of Sir Moses Montefiore. She's the daughter of his brother Abraham. And she did a lot of work. This is one of her later, this is from the 1850s, but in the early 1840s, she partnered together with Grace Aguilar, actually, and David Aaron de Sola to produce a library of novels known as the Cheap Jewish Library, which again were like a series of novels that were depicting Jewish scenes, whether historic romances. Grace Aguilar produces one that takes place in Inquisition Spain, but some are even in kind of more kind of contemporary English settings. And again, this idea that there needs to be positive depictions of Jews for Jews to read and to be inspired by. And then this work is a bit more of a kind of a polemic work where she insists on, what she thinks Judaism should look like. She had an interesting story. She ended up marrying an uncle of hers, not Sir Moses, a fellow by the name of Horatio Montefiore. And Horatio was one of the people who helped or who ultimately joined the West London Synagogue of Reformed Jews. So while her earlier works in the 40s were produced with the Chazan, David Aaron de Sola, and I would say at that point she's kind of firmly in the traditional camp. By the time she produces this, she's now in the reform camp. And so this work actually kind of advocates certain reforms as well. But she was a daughter of the community and again had been quite close with the de Sola family in that respect. So she's another interesting figure. And then the final one over here, I don't have a picture of her to my great lament, But this is a work by Miriam Mendez Bellisario in 1856. And it turns out, you can see here, it's a little hard to read. She says also that she was the author of Me'ir Ayin B'nei HaNe'urim. So here she, in a sense, outs herself as the author of this earlier vocabulary. So while in 1848, she didn't put her name to it, by the time she produces this work in the 1850s, she does put her name to it. And this is a work which is fantastic. We did a whole, I don't know, almost like 6 months of studying it this past year. This work covers a range of topics, really, again, a work of theology, trying to understand, what are Jewish beliefs, what are, the 13 principles of faith. It talks about the 10 commandments. So it talks about Jewish values as well, like what are the ideals of Judaism, and then also focuses on Jewish practices and customs. And it's actually one of the earliest records that I've been able to find of descriptions of Spanish and Portuguese customs. The way she describes how one should shake the lulav and so forth. So a really interesting work. And this will be, I'm spending quite a lot of time on her actually in my PhD. In that chapter on the women, there'll be a whole part specifically on her, because this work has not been, studied properly in the kind of academic literature, and I think it's a phenomenal work. The picture I've put to the side over here is a painting that was made by her cousin, Isaac Mendez Bellisario. This is the oldest painting, it's really an etching that's just been colored in, of the interior of Bevis Mark Synagogue. So, when people are trying to figure out, what did Bevis look like 200 years ago? This is the oldest one we have. This is from 1818, and that was from her cousin. So she's part of that family. So again, you kind of think of all the names that we've had over here, Mendez Bellisario, Montefiore, Lindo, Aguilar, right? Very clear, distinctive, these kind of Spanish and Portuguese, Western Sephardic names. And I'll just stop the share here. And again, I would say, while they kind of are doing a lot of their works individually, collectively, they represent a trend. And as I said, De Sola is kind of involved with some of them, either in editing their works or revising their works. So he's very kind of like engaged in it. While he produces the translations, they're kind of producing these kinds of materials. And it's a great moment. What's I think kind of makes you step back is that, you don't find that it continues, into the 1860s, 1870s, within kind of the traditionalist Sephardic community. You don't find more and more of these works being produced. There will be individuals here and there. We could talk about some, from the Sassoon family and so forth, but really kind of this kind of movement. And to me, what's interesting is a lot of these ladies come from families that were quite scholarly in of themselves. Abigail Lindo's father was an academic. Certainly, you see in the Aguilar family, her brother co-wrote the first book on the music of the community with David Aaron De Sola. The Mendez Bellisario, her grandfather was a Ruby, was one of the teachers in the community school. So they kind of are coming from families that are, interested in Jewish study. And so the apple is not falling far from the tree. The difference is that now it's women also that are doing it, but there is this kind of, I would say, scholarly class within the community of men, but also the women in their family as well, which I think is really interesting and something quite exciting. It could be the reason that it kind of tapers off is either because kind of the moment of, shall we say, panic has lifted, kind of the schism of the communities has become history. There could be like this sense that things have kind of settled And so there isn't that same kind of like push to create these things. And so there isn't a vacuum to be filled in that respect. Or it could be eventually the community does appoint a new Chacham in Benjamin Art Tome. And it could be, then there's this kind of sense, okay, now there's like now there's a man, right, to produce these things, and the women in the community don't continue to do it. Ultimately, I think it's unfortunate that it doesn't continue. But I think for our respects, it's nice to have a paradigm, a model from 2 centuries ago, already from then, of women who are, intellectually engaged and are producing Jewish literature for the benefit, of the community, and maybe can act as an inspiration for more women in our community to do those kinds of activities, in addition to the men of our community as well. I think I'll pause now. I imagine some of you may have some questions. Obviously, this is a topic I could talk about for hours on end. There's so much more to say. This was just kind of a quick type of overview, just something kind of interesting, hopefully delectable for your lunch and learn study. But if anyone has any questions or anything they'd like to put out there, please feel free to do so.
Have you found any articles by Dorothy Belasco?
I haven't. Who is that?
She was a lady, obviously. When you say who is she, she was a member of the community, and she was an artist, and I have been told that she wrote articles and/or books.
Do you know when did she live?
She lived in the 20th century.
Right.
So that's probably outside your period.
Right. I haven't looked into that. Interesting, though.
Right.
I will look into it, because I think that I'm curious to kind of know if others have kind of ultimately followed up and done these things too. So I will Dorothy Belasco, you said?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Anybody else have any questions or thoughts? Yeah, Claire.
How widely read were these books? How popular were they? And was it just confined to the Spanish and Portuguese community, or did the Ashkenazim, for instance, read it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. We can't always answer those things, because it's hard to know for sure. What's interesting is in some of these works, they often have a almost like a pre-order page on them, where it lists all the people who bought copies. So I guess they kind of would put out there saying, I'm going to produce this text, and then people would kind of pre-order. So all of those pre-orders are there. So you can see, before some of these books, 25 were bought by Moses Montefiore, probably for the community school, 8 by this person. It might even be, 10 were bought by the Chazan in Jamaica, which again probably meant that he was going to use it in the Spanish and Portuguese school there. So you can get like a little bit of a sense of kind of like where initial copies were sent to. What sometimes is indicative if there were future printings of the book. So if it was published more than once, that can sometimes indicate that it was used more broadly. Certainly Grace Aguilar was read, beyond. I think beyond that, with the others, it's hard to say. I do think that these works were studied outside of London's Sephardic community and would have been studied in the American Spanish and Portuguese communities too, and in some of the Caribbean ones. So we're kind of the English-speaking Spanish and Portuguese communities. Whether Ashkenazim were using them in their schools, it's hard to say. I think you have to appreciate that in the Ashkenazi schools, they're also still dealing with lots of immigrants. And so they're having people moving from Eastern Europe and so forth, where English is not their native tongue. So while there was an Ashkenazi community that had been here, since the late 17th century, It could be the dynamics in those communities are different than in the Sephardic community. And you get the sense that these materials are really produced for, the Sephardic community. Again, even the way that she transliterates Shema as Shemang, shows that either she didn't know that other people pronounced it differently, like that's how kind of like separate the communities were, or it just didn't matter because it wasn't for the Ashkenazi community. So I think you get a sense of like how almost like robust the Spanish and Portuguese community was. That there was this need to produce all these texts for the community itself. And I think that's something in of itself, I think interesting to note. I think, to me, the most interesting of all these works is the one from Bellisario. I don't know ultimately how many people actually read it or studied it. I think its value is probably more in its content and what the work reflects than maybe on what influence the work ultimately had.
Do you go to the British Library? Or, well, not now because of COVID, but how did you find these books? How do you do your research for your PhD?
It's through a variety of things. I mean, I definitely use the British Library sometimes to access old works if you want to kind of see them in original. But thankfully, a lot of materials have been digitized. So, you kind of Google around. There's some Facebook groups that were, like a couple years ago, I typed in, does anybody know of any materials produced by women? And I kind of people, you kind of benefit from what other people already are aware of. And then you can kind of find some of the stuff online. And sometimes you need to actually go to the library to look at things. I mean, the part where you sometimes, is interesting, where archives become helpful, is something I've looked at are trying to find if there's letters that these ladies wrote as well. Because they actually, we have letters of their correspondence with rabbis, which is another really interesting dynamic where you have, there's, this kind of conversation that's taking place too between rabbis and women, which I think is also really interesting. So some of that has been digitized too now by different archives, and some of that you still got to go and search through them to find the materials. So it's a mixed bag how you kind of do it. It's just a lot of poking around.
It's very interesting.
Thank you. Yeah, Eddie.
Yeah. Do we know if any of these ladies, Lady Montefiore, obviously, but did any of the other ladies play any part in the community itself, as opposed from just their literary talents? Obviously, the governance of the Spanish and Portuguese was exclusively male back in those days.
Right.
But did they play any part that, there would have been possibly equivalent of a ladies' guild, but maybe in the charitable institutions? Were any of them trustees of the charities and those sort of things? Did they play an active role within the community itself?
Yeah, thanks, Eddie. That's a good question. I don't know 100%. I mean, to be a trustee, you tended to have to be a bit more well off, right? So I think Charlotte Montefiore probably was. I don't know that the other women were. I think that would have kind of been, to act as like the head of these charities. And it was popular for women to do that, but more well-off women to kind of, run the infants, society, or a charity for this purpose or a charity for that purpose. But usually to do that meant that you had time on your hands, which if you had time on your hands, it meant you had money, right? Otherwise, that wouldn't have been possible. But I think something that you point that maybe is worth stating, is most of these women, when they're producing these materials, are not married, and if they are married, they don't have children. And I think that speaks to kind of the realities, perhaps, of life in the 19th century, of women, and kind of the responsibilities they would have had to their husbands, but certainly if they had children, kind of in the domestic sphere, to be able to do that. And I think if you were well off and married, you probably could get away with maybe having other people cook. But if you had children, that probably would have then already been something else. If you were not well off, once you were married, forget it. I mean, you would have your whole day would have been taken up by cooking and doing the laundry and, you know, the expectations, you know, of what a woman would be doing at that time. So I think that, you know, as a result, some women probably chose not to get married, you know, if they were interested in doing this work. I mean, you go to America, one of the famous women in the community is Rebecca Gratz. And, you know, she famously, you know, was beautiful and had all these, you know, suitors, and she chose to not marry. And then one of the explanations is, you know, wanting to devote her time to other causes that she wouldn't have been able to do as a married woman. So I think that there's, you know, a lot at play kind of when you think about class and wealth and expected roles when it comes to this type of thing.
Interesting.
I think that's, you know, one of the things that's interesting about, you know, our day and age is that, you know, we obviously no longer have those, you know, limits, you know, or expectations of limits, meaning obviously when one has a family, there are more things to be busy with, but, you know, it doesn't have to be something that means that you don't have time for anything else, you know, that there is room for people to still do other things too. Anybody else have any thoughts? Yeah, Isaac.
I was sort of curious about it because you said at the beginning and at the end how you know, that you sort of hope this would encourage more like similar works from women today. And I was also like sort of amused by the power because you were talking about like what must be the effect of not having a hacham of the kahal. And you know, of course, as long as I can remember, there's yeah, that's also the case we have now as well. So yeah, I don't know, like, well, we've certainly no shortage of scholarly, educated women in this kahal. I mean, what things do you think the kahal can do to sort of foster an atmosphere of you know, writing like what's happening then, and sort of try and rejuvenate, as you were saying?
Yeah, that's a great question, Isaac. You know, one of the things that people have kind of spoken about historically is, in general, about the Spanish and Portuguese community is, you know, there's a sense that the community has not had, you know, the same level of scholarship that you might find within Ashkenazi communities, you know, with producing Talmud scholars and, you know, biblical experts and things like that. So I think, you know, it's a general challenge for our community to say that it's important, it's good, you know, like people have different choices of professions, you know, of what to go into, you know, and we should be encouraging, you know, people who want to become, you know, scholars and academics and so forth, as well as even people who are not maybe professionally those things, but are still devoting their time to things of interest and want to, you know, produce, you know, so something might be maybe some kind of, you know, journal, or, you know, like things that could be not maybe where the bar is not as high of, you know, to produce an entire work, but where people can kind of contribute to something, you know, might be a way of saying, you know, hey, if you have an area of interest, good, research it, write something about it, you know, and that I think maybe can engage people a bit more in something like that. I mean, they're just kind of not something I've actually thought so much about beyond kind of just promoting the idea of it. But I think what you're asking, Isaac, is a good question to be asking, which is, you know, are there, you know, maybe some practical ways to kind of encourage it?
I've not heard that floated before, a kahal journal. That could be quite cool.
Yeah, just thought of it now. You know, it could be there's better ideas. It could be that's a bad idea. You know, but I think it's something that's good to think about. And again, because I think, you know, nowadays this is a question not just I think to men as well. You know, I think it's something just in general within our community. How do you foster a love of study and you know, publishing and you know, and kind of academic pursuit?
Specifically for women in the kahal, do you think there's other things the community could be doing to foster that? It's
a good question. I think those are the kinds of things we need to think about, and it could be people in the community have thoughts, and people should I'd welcome if people want to, make suggestions and things like that as well. But I think broadly speaking, it's an important idea. The study of Torah is the great gift that we have. Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you, Isaac. Anybody else have any other thoughts? Wonderful. Okay, so maybe we will call it here. It's been a pleasure studying with all of you. Thank you all for attending and participating, and for your comments. And I look forward to having other opportunities to study with you. For anybody that's interested, this month I'm also doing a series on Jewish theology for modern times. And so we're looking at some important areas of Jewish thought and kind of how modern Jewish thinkers have thought about it, including the late Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs. That takes place on Monday nights at 6 o'clock. So if anybody's interested, please join us tonight. We're going to be doing perhaps the heaviest of all of them, which is dealing with tragedy and evil in the world. And we'll be looking at the way modern Jewish thinkers have thought about that very challenging question. Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Thank you all so much. Nice to see you all. Have a good day and stay safe.
Thanks.
Bye.
One other thing, actually, I don't know if Lilna's left early, and she messaged me to ask, do you know where the recording going to be posted somewhere?
Of today's lecture.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'll add this to my YouTube channel.
Oh, nice.
And I'll post it into the community WhatsApp group, or to the synagogue group. So from there, people can kind of see it and take more of a look at it. Great. Okay, everyone.
Thanks so much. Super interesting.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thanks very much.
Pleasure.
Bye.
Thank you.